All right. Welcome to our inaugural or our initial colloquium presentation for this fall's calendar for the Yale Council on Middle East Studies. My name is Jonathan Wyrtzen, and I get to be the host today of the first of these sessions. And it's really a pleasure to be able to welcome a much wider audience. It's one of the advantages of being forced to do these on Zoom. And it's really, it's just wonderful to be able to have this group together today from all over the world, really, to be able to listen in and participate on this first session. I am welcoming you on behalf of the Council on Middle East Studies, and I just wanted to say some thanks as we get started in terms of the background work that went into get today's session together and the rest of the fall's program. First, the chair of the Council on Middle East Studies, Marcia Inhorn, had the idea this semester, and if you look at the rest of the calendar, to bring together a group of Yale faculty that is working on the Middle East, and for us to be able to present our work, which a lot of times we don't get to do here on campus itself and to this community. This was all planned before COVID shifted the logistics of this. But the really fascinating thing is that as I mentioned before, we get to share this. Second, I wanted to thank Kristen Siebert and Mara Habor, who are program director and program coordinator for the Council on Middle East Studies, who've been working on this. And lastly, Dr. Vish Saktavel and Dr. Daniel Tavana. Those are postdoctoral associates that are being welcomed in North African Studies and Middle East Studies this year. And it is a true privilege and a pleasure to have them joining us. And they are also just doing a ton of work to get this together and to make this happen. So with those preliminaries out of the way, we get to turn to today's talk and this conversation we're gonna be able to have with Professor Elizabeth Nugent. Liz is Assistant Professor of Political Science here at Yale, and hot off the presses, her first book, After Repression, How Polarization Derails Democratic Transition, has come out, and definitely pick it up. Electronic copy, physical copy, and get into this book. I think we're going to talk a lot about it today, but it could not be more timely. Moving into the fall of 2020, to be reading a book and getting into the careful study that Liz has made of the two cases here, Tunisia and Egypt, and on the 10th anniversary of the uprisings beginning in the fall of 2010 in Tunisia and then leading to the transitions that have happened in the past decade. It's perfect to be able to start off with this. So thank you so much, Liz, for joining us. I wanted to kick it over to you and because it is so new, a lot of people that are in the audience have not had a chance to read it. So if you could just kind of give us an overview, just summarize your argument, the cases, just give us a little bit of context that we can build off moving forward in the conversation.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And thanks as well. Just want to echo Jonathan in thanking Vish, Dan, Kristen, and Marwa for all the work they're doing. It's not easy to transition this entire speaker series online. So in the book, Jonathan showed you the soft cover. This is the hard cover. Exactly the same, just more expensive. I look at two cases, Egypt and Tunisia. These were, as most of you probably know, two of the early movers in the Arab Spring. Tunisia is kind of where everything got kicked off, and Egypt closely followed, in January of 2011. I started what was my dissertation, now is the book, with a question of trying to figure out why these countries ended up in such different places in such a quick amount of time, really within 3 years. Not that it's a perfect success story, but in Tunisia, you continue to see, continued consolidation towards democratic consolidation, more elections, transitional justice campaign that's been pretty impressive. While in Egypt by 2014, you end up with retrenched authoritarianism, and some folks have started to categorize the new regime as even different in kind of the qualitative nature of authoritarianism under President al-Sisi. So that was the initial question. Why are these two countries in such different places so quickly after the revolution? And then kind of the more academic-y question became, why were these two countries so differently polarized? Because it became very clear to me that polarization was not only key for democratic transitions, but was also very different in these two places. So in Tunisia, you had low levels of what I call preference polarization. There was a lot of agreement about religion and politics and how it should be enshrined in the constitution. And also high levels of what's called affective polarization. So feelings of goodwill, the ability to cooperate among the politicians charged with navigating the transition. In Egypt, you have high levels of political polarization and preference polarization, a lot of disagreement about the role of religion in politics that really derails debates about the Constitution and other key moments of the transition. And you also have very bad affect or high levels of affective polarization between the different actors charged with navigating the transition. The tension between the Brotherhood and their secular opponents is really debilitating in terms of moving the transition forward. So that, those were kind of that's the broad argument. I'm happy to talk a little bit about how I got to that question. I don't know.
That was I think there's two sides of this that I wanted to have you give us a little bit of background story. I think for all of us that end up working on whatever we work on, we happen to work on the Middle East, there's a story in that. And I'm interested in on the kind of maybe the personal thing, how you end up working on Egypt and Tunisia. But I guess as you get into that sort of melding of that biographical dimension or just, the pathway through which you get into these two stories of Tunisia and Egypt. But also, I'm thinking how you see this book engaging different audiences. So I'm thinking of like, who are the people that you really, having worked for over more than a decade, well over the decade now, who you're talking to in that?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I'm teaching a mixed methods course this semester, and one thing we talk about is case selection. And there's often this assumption that we come to our cases randomly or through some kind of strategy. Egypt is a case that I love, and I've also been working on it for a long time. I studied abroad at AUC a long time ago. When I was in college, it was the safest place to do language study. Lebanon was off limits, but Egypt was okay. So, it was a country that I knew a lot about before I started my PhD. I lived there after college, worked for the Ibn Khaldun Center. It was a case that I knew a lot about. And I was initially really excited. I applied for graduate school in 2010, started in 2011. I was all about, I'm going to study democratization in the Middle East following the Arab Spring uprisings. And going back to Egypt over the next couple of years before it became really difficult, it was clear that, authoritarianism was still really important for explaining what was happening. And Tunisia was a newer case for me. Part of this, after the 2013 coup, it became more difficult to do research in Egypt. And so thinking through other cases that made sense from, a methodological perspective, Tunisia was on my list. And when I went there, having like a pretty firm grasp of Egyptian politics, it was so clear how different the conversation was between and about different political groups. I point to a couple of examples in the book where you had communist and kind of center secular groups and Islamists all at the same protest, advocating for the same causes in a way that my knowledge of Egypt just, made me think this would never happen in a place like Egypt. So it was helpful to have that deep background in Egypt when I started the Tunisian case. In terms of audience, I'm hoping this will be, something interesting for people who care about each of these countries, both Egypt and Tunisia, scholars who approach it, these countries from different perspectives, historians, sociologists, psychologists, all like that. I also tried hard under, pressure from my advisors to make this more of a comparative politics argument. So I think people who are interested in democratic transitions, how polarization not only forms, but then also can derail, politics, both during major moments of transition, but also, during regular times. One thing I talk about at the end of the book is that I think there are lessons from this study for, consolidated democracies, the polarization and the way in which people see themselves either as similar victims, part of, a similarly victimized group or not, can have real implications for the ability to, come to the compromises and cooperation that are necessary for democratic politics.
That was something I wanted to, if you could help us in terms of plotting this on the map of the state of the study of the comparative politics of the Middle East and what have been the dominant, I guess, the puzzles or the questions that have oriented the field, and where your books fits on that map, and where it's really pushing, like where is it contributing into those discussions?
Yeah, so I think, the stuff that comes to mind has to do with the persistence of authoritarianism and the legacies of authoritarianism. What I'm hoping I bring to that discussion, or kind of, the way in which I hope I push it forward, is by thinking through the victims of state repression and of authoritarianism. A lot of existing literature on authoritarianism thinks about it from the perspective of the regime. So why do they repress in different ways? And how does it, extend their longevity or protect them from uprisings? And what I'm hoping to, or what I hope I do in the book, is really look at the people who experience repression. How do they experience it? How do they make sense of it as a major influential life event? And also, how does the nature of repression matter, right? Not all regimes repress in the same way. Not all authoritarianism is the same. What does it mean for a highly repressive regime going after everybody? That has different implications than a divided structure like in Egypt, where you have one group that's really being targeted, developing this internal identity and rhetoric about being uniquely victimized in a way that's, really interesting but highly problematic for trying to get the opposition to work together. So I hope, what I'm adding is kind of this political psychology of repression and how it affects the actors beyond just, strategic calculations. Because I don't know, when I've spoken to the people, a lot of them featured in the book and quoted by name, they're not necessarily thinking, okay, it's harder for us to mobilize, so now we're going to, join with this other group so we can win in this very small amount of space that the regime lets us contest. No, they're thinking about, how did this affect my family? How did this affect my body? How did this affect the trajectory of my life? And that's the kind of stuff that I try to capture in here and make sense of in a way that connects it back to bigger political developments. And, the way in which how these actors behave, conditioned through repression, matters for whether or not, democratic consolidation is allowed to happen or authoritarianism becomes more retrenched.
Yeah, that leads into this question that I had. If you could talk us through a bit the different methodologies that you used in both Tunisia and Egypt. Sidebar, I think a lot of the audience this is not news for, but lots of constraints in doing this kind of work in the region. But the ways that you were able to do the different methodologies, and maybe just kind of give us some background on that. I don't think everybody knows the really amazing type of data that you're able to get here, and the length of the work. You didn't parachute in, obviously, in some kind of stereotype of a certain kind of social science researcher, just for brief episodes in Tunisia and Egypt. If you could give us a little bit of that story too.
Yeah, so the book absolutely uses a mixed methods approach to answering this question. The two main components are these case studies of Egypt and Tunisia, and in those case studies, I rely quite a bit on fieldwork that I did. It was about a year total between 2012, 2013, and 2018. Tunisia, I was able to spend a lot more time there on the ground. It has, increasingly become quite easy and frankly pleasant to do research there. People are available; they're willing to talk about these kinds of questions. So that was, I spent a bunch of time living in Tunisia doing these interviews, kind of for an extended period of time. With Egypt, I had started making smaller trips, summer trips, starting my second or third year of graduate school. But by the time, of 2013, 2014, it was illegal by Egyptian law to do research on the Muslim Brotherhood, or there were at least legal implications of interviewing these folks because they were now deemed terrorists. So a lot of that research ended up happening outside of the country. A lot of Brotherhood members ended up in places like New York, London, Istanbul. And so I was lucky enough to go and meet some of these different groups and interview them there. I was also able to make a research trip in 2018, just before there was kind of another wave of repression against the remaining opposition. But for those on the call, I would not recommend, going and trying to do this kind of research right now. So yeah, I mean, the challenges of collecting this kind of data was real, but the combination of these interviews, which were really illuminating, looking at memoirs, to the extent that I could find writings that occurred in the past, people writing about their jail and prison and exile experiences from decades ago. I also include the mixed methods component of it comes from a lab experiment that I ran in Tunisia. I kept getting the same critique over and over again. Well, if the term we love to use in political science is endogeneity. So if the kind of repression that groups are experiencing is endogenous to something that's important, the level of polarization, for example, there's going to be an issue. So, the gold standard there is randomizing. So randomizing repression is obviously not feasible or ethical. So what I did was conduct a lab experiment where individuals were recruited, assigned to random groups, and then given information about whether a punitive police policy would affect their group in isolation or their group in another group, and measured some of these identity outcomes and levels of polarization to try and capture this process that the qualitative data had really, outlined for me. And so, that setup gave me some additional leverage over the causal process and the direction of the causal arrow. So those are kind of the two main components. I also have, in the conclusion, I talk about potential transitions in Indonesia and Algeria as other cases where, one question that always comes up is whether Egypt's military is so different that, it's not comparable to other cases. Indonesia had Tunisia's level of polarization and Egypt's military, to simplify in probably a very gross way, and doesn't end up with a coup. So it's a nice additional case to think through how polarization is really key for the military intervening in domestic politics.
Could you maybe follow up a bit on that? You mentioned this idea of like teasing out the direction of the causal arrow, or maybe the pathway, and maybe if you could talk us through that a bit, because the book builds up a case on the institutional side for the story of a particular apparatus that these states inherit from the colonial period that then goes, continues on up to the prelude up at 2010, 11. That's a part of your story. And then you also have, this explanation of, on the side of the oppositional forces, the ways that the psychological interfaces with the social, and then there's organizational dimensions of that. And if you could maybe just kind of get us down into some of that, what your argument is there.
Yeah, so the argument, the big issue that led me to focus much more on this historical endowment in terms of the coercive apparatus, and for the lab experiment, is that there's often this assumption, at least in political science study of repression, that regimes are repressing strategically. They look around, they have perfect information, they're able to, or good enough information, they're able to discern what a threat is, and then they repress strategically. And so if that's the case, something else is doing the work instead of, the argument that I'm making. So what I wanted to do, and I hope I do it convincingly, it's full disclosure, my least favorite chapter of the book is chapter 3, but the idea here is that my assumption is that these regimes are set up to repress in a certain way. So they have these institutional legacies. In the Middle East, this corresponds with the colonial period. This is a major moment of state building. And this essentially constrains the regime to repress in a certain way. So they're not reacting necessarily to the way the opposition is acting. They're not responding to levels of polarization among the opposition. Instead, Egypt, we look at Egypt, from Nasser on, look back under the British, it's very much a targeted repressive environment where they are always repressing. I mean, this is, again, a simplification, but they're always repressing a group, co-opting another group. And that target can change, but the way in which their coercive institutions and intelligence gathering institutions are set up means that, they're essentially, they have a hammer and they see nails, instead of kind of the other way around. Yeah, does that answer the question?
So that sets up that there's it's isolating, I guess, the true importance of that experience of the oppositional side from below, of having these two treatments of undifferentiated repression versus differentiated. But then so that kind of sets that up. But then you unpack, I guess, the mechanisms, like at the individual and in these collective levels, that kind of where that work happens. So you have this outside treatment on it, but this is what's actually going on.
Right.
Maybe walk us through your argument there too.
Right. So my assumption is, in chapter 3, I demonstrate that Egypt and Tunisia and regimes beyond that come to repress in certain ways because of these institutional legacies, these inheritances. Repression, in the way I think about it, is not this constraint on opposition behavior. It's very much this, traumatic psychological experience, potentially traumatic physically and in other ways, in a way that makes it a key component of identity formation. And then the next step, it's basically repression to identity formation to political polarization, drawing on some of the political psych literature. And you alluded to this, the way in which repression shapes identity is through these 3 components. The most important one for me is the psychological mechanism, where it reveals to a repressed group who else is a member of their group. And here I mean as part of the broader opposition, right? If everyone's being repressed, they're more likely to then identify as a broader opposition. There's more of a bridging identity instead of a focus on the individual, identities where the group would be the basis for that. So in, Egypt in this case is a targeted repressive environment. Egypt is repressing the Brotherhood under the Mubarak regime time and again. That reveals to the opposition that there is a difference between these groups, right? And so the Brotherhood identity, and others have documented this as well, is becoming, hardened, uniquely victimized in a way that increases political polarization. This is a group that distance itself, both in terms of political preferences and in affect from other groups. In Tunisia, what was so interesting is that you end up with, members, communist members of the secular opposition, Islamists, center secular, basically anybody you can think of in the opposition was in the same spaces, in jail together, in exile together. And the information that they receive is that we're all being treated very similarly. We are all part of this broader group that's being repressed. And that, through the psychological mechanism, decreases political polarization. The 2 other components kind of work in interaction with that. So the social mechanism is literally these groups are interacting with each other, or they're not, depending on a repressive, targeted or a widespread repressive regime, right? The Brotherhood under Mubarak ends up in jails by themselves. In Tunisia, you end up with, there are a couple of really interesting anecdotes in the book of Islamists and secular opposition in the same jail cells for, a long period of time. Also in exile together, that was a tactic that the Ben Ali regime used quite effectively. A lot of these men, and they were, predominantly men, ended up in places like Paris. And so that experience of being in exile, being, a Muslim in Europe, a bunch of different things helped facilitate identity formation that facilitated, cooperation among them. And then finally, the organizational mechanism I talk about, in a targeted repressive regime, you end up with, organizations trying to defend themselves, again, turning in, being defensive, very exclusive. In a targeted repressive environment, because it's affecting so many different groups, you end up with weaker organizations at kind of the opposition group level. But then some of these bridging groups, there are a couple that I name in the book, that really focused on human rights issues, things that multiple groups could work in, and essentially speak to in a legitimate way.
Great. Thanks. I'm gonna go ahead. As you can see, there's a Q&A section where you can put in any questions that you have. And there's already some that are coming up that are starting to get some of the questions that I had too. So I think it makes sense to transition to that. And the way this will go is you guys put those questions in, I'll go ahead and read them out and with your name and let Liz respond to it. So first from Marcia Inhorn, she's asking if you could give us a brief update on the Muslim Brotherhood right now, kind of roll us up to the present, both in Egypt and in exile. And I think, maybe in that, if you could kind of just, kind of roll this up a bit on the present day situation after having studied this, and you sent, this is one of those things that it's constantly moving target. You send in your manuscript and your stories keep going forward. So maybe just in general, how you see the present.
Yeah, so as part of the authoritarian retrenchment that I document in the book, I more or less stop at 2014, although I allude to events since then. In July 2013, there was a coup that unseated Mohamed Morsi, a former Brotherhood member who had been elected, democratically elected president. That ushers in a pretty harsh wave of repression against the Brotherhood. Within a year, there's 60,000 people arrested, most of them Brotherhood. Those who were not arrested, who were able to escape for whatever reason, there's a small group of folks who ended up in Istanbul, where I met a lot of them, in London. But by year's end, by 2014, the Brotherhood was declared a terrorist organization. So at the current moment, they're doing, there's kind of a combination. There's, in Egypt, not a lot of activity because most of the members are either in hiding or in jail. And sadly, the situation in Egyptian prisons is not great, and a number of leading Brotherhood members have sadly died while in prison. Those in exile, it's been interesting to watch. I think initially there was a lot of anger about what had happened, probably rightfully so. They're not blameless, but I'm not sure that they deserved the response that the regime has had to them. But at the same time, they've done quite a bit, in more recent years, they've done quite a bit of reflection on what they did wrong. They are very much, rethinking what happened, what they might do should they come to power again. They have tried to reach across the aisle, so to speak, and work with other groups that are also in exile. And one thing I can speak a little bit about is this is an interesting period in Egyptian history. This is a very repressive moment where the Sisi regime seems to be going all out. It's really, changed the way it represses from being a targeted regime to now going after basically anyone who is mobilized against the regime. And the implications of my argument is that we should see less polarization as a result among different kinds of groups. And I had a piece, I think it's posted on the CMES website, that I wrote in the Washington Post about this. When Mohamed Morsi died, he was in court. He dropped dead from I think a heart attack as a result of really terrible conditions in prison. The rhetoric from groups who were very supportive of the coup and of his ouster was frankly striking. They were very sad about this. There have been a number of other incidents where Muslim Brotherhood members have died, or younger members have been unable to walk because of the torture that they've faced in prison. And so, the rhetoric is surprising in that it's very sympathetic. It seems to be demonstrating that the way in which this regime is repressing everybody has built sympathy among these groups, perhaps reshaping their identity as a broader group of victimized opposition in a way that, if there's one hopeful thing to take away, that might help facilitate the compromise and cooperation that's necessary for any future democratization. But yeah, it's certainly an interesting moment to think about what's going to happen with the Brotherhood long term. They don't really have operations in Egypt at this moment.
It made me think, in a little bit of a follow-up to that, is how have any of them been looking to Tunisia, to Tunisia as a model for themselves? These, you mentioned some of the Muslim Brotherhood kind of rethinking what they did right, what they did wrong, and so either both as an example, or even in terms of direct relations with Nahda.
Yeah, I don't know much about the latter, whether they have direct relations with Anatha. I mean, I think these groups are generally in conversation with each other, but the new project that I'm working on is explicitly interested in this idea of exile as a place of political regeneration. And a number of people I've interviewed have mentioned, that they have individually studied the Tunisian opposition and exile as perhaps a source of inspiration for what they could be doing. But it does require working with people that they have a significant amount of animosity towards. So, we could be hopeful, but it is interesting when, people you're studying kind of pick up on the same themes that you're picking up on, that Tunisia might be a case of inspiration, for how they might move forward on these things.
Right. I'll move on to the next question from Mohammed Dia Hamami. And there's two questions, so I'm going to take them and have you answer. I'm going to take them individually. So he says, throughout the book, you have two expressions. You differentiate between elite polarization and mass polarization. And he asked if you could explain the difference between these two, especially in terms of their impact on the democratization process, or the transition.
Yeah, was there a second question, or is that one question?
It's a different question, so if you go with that, and then I'll ask the other one.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've gotten some pushback on this. The elites that I'm talking about are basically the political actors who would be in the room negotiating, the things that matter for democratization. These are members of parliament, party members, kind of at the more elite or leader level, heads of parties, et cetera. And I differentiate between that and mass polarization, which would be, voter polarization or polarization among different segments of society. And I do that because, there are a couple of reasons why. First, what I'm talking about is really individuals in power who are negotiating and hashing this stuff out. And I also subscribe to the view that elite polarization drives mass polarization. So when you polarize elites, there's quite a bit of literature on this in political science about elite cues and the way in which elites can prime constituents to feel, more negatively, and that their opinions are more different from other groups of people. I talk a little bit about this in the conclusion. I think there is evidence that actually Tunisians were less polarized, more polarized than Egyptians, because there was, wait, now I'm forgetting. Anyway, I talk about it in the conclusion. But my assumption is that while that's clearly important, it's really like an elite-led process. Like mass polarization is clearly important, but I'm assuming that, the elite process is kind of what's driving that.
So it's privilege on that. And I guess maybe just...
I want to say Tunisia is more polarized at the, yeah, I'm going to stick with that.
Okay. I think also something to maybe clarify is that the key period here is that these experiences and the levels, the way that repression articulates with polarization at the elite or the mass level is so important during these transition moments where you have a provisional government and you've got this group, oppositional, right, spectrum that's going to do something in that moment. So I guess maybe that was also the thing in terms of your argument here, that it makes the most difference because the elites, they have clientele, obviously they have their constituency, but that polarization dimension of that, it's really most important in their own interactions together and in the room, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Am I right on that? Okay.
Yeah, and one of our colleague, Libby Wood, has an interesting definition where the people that she's looking at in a similar manner are basically those whose buy-in are really important for, whatever agreement happens to actually become, reality. So in this case, it's like the major heads of parties, the leadership of parties, the members of these NCAs and parliaments and whatnot, Those are kind of the key people. That's what I mean by elite when I refer to it at that level.
Okay. This is continuing on this question about Tunisia in chapter 5, when you focus on the Ben Ali period, 1987 to 2010. Mohammed's also asking why you didn't include Bourguiba's period, even though that seems relevant to Tunisian politics since the rise of the Bourguiba's nationalist parties such as Nida Tunis and the PDL.
Yeah, that's another great question. So in my fieldwork, I actually asked about this because a number of, for those of you who are not familiar with Tunisia, Bourguiba was the first president. Ben Ali comes to power in 1987 through a bloodless coup. And so I asked a number of people, especially Ahmed Najib Shebi, who I talk about in the book, had experienced repression under both regimes. And I asked them, if they had experiences in either the opposition or under repression, how this differed. I didn't include it partially because it would have been a much longer book if I had gone back all the way. But the answer I got time and again was that there was a very similar logic under Bourguiba, but it was not quite as harsh. So Ben Ali became much more, I don't know what the term, I guess violent, became much more violent. But there was still widespread repression under Bourguiba. And there was a different feeling about Bourguiba. There was kind of this like, he was the founding father of our country. And so sure, he might've repressed, but that was in the nature of establishing a country. So there was a different level of like reverence for him. But I think the same logic holds. What I would say is, there's repression by the Bourguiba regime in the early 80s that kind of lets up in a way that there's less polarization at the moment of transition. And Ben Ali comes to power in this way where he is proclaiming he's going to be this democratic alternative. And then, over time, 89, 90, 91, he starts becoming much more repressive over time.
Next question is from an anonymous, it's an anonymous question asking about what the gender, if there are, what the gender dimensions are in Tunisia, and I'm going to throw in Egypt too.
Yeah, so for the most part, in both cases, we're talking about men, just given, the nature of the world, and also that these are somewhat conservative countries. There are certainly more women who were political activists in Tunisia. And beyond that, the Tunisian state was willing to repress women to a much larger extent than the Egyptian state. There's been some really interesting investigative reporting on this by, I think, the New York Times even, about how women were repressed and tortured and sexually assaulted by state agents, both for their own political activity, but also for their husbands or their partners or their fathers, in a way that's actually super interesting. Hind Ahmed Zeki, who teaches at UConn, does a similar comparison in that it's between Egypt and Tunisia, looking at state feminism projects. And Tunisia is always held up as this very progressive state in terms of women's rights. And on many dimensions they are, right? Like they legalized abortion, and it very early, I think the 1950s, it makes the conversation about reproductive choice very different in Tunisia than elsewhere. But repressing a woman as an extension of her husband is pretty, not very feminist. So I have some stories in there. I've saved some of it for a separate article that I'm still working on, where a number of men, while they were in jail, their wives experienced really terrible things on their behalf while they were literally, constrained, could not do anything about it. Egypt, you do have, some verbal harassment, but the state is not, sending its agents to rape wives of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's less of like a systematic thing in Egypt when it does happen.
Another question is, although widespread repression in Tunisia led to decreased levels of polarization, did the co-optation of secular elites threaten this? I guess it's the differentiation that there is, like, by the way that they reach out to the secular elites and bring them inside the fold, did that not affect your assumption about widespread or undifferentiated polarization?
Yeah, so in Tunisia, I do talk a little bit about these parties that were either co-opted or emerged as kind of splinters from the ruling party. And what's interesting is that these parties, as soon as they're no longer useful, are also repressed. So members of the MDS, you know, some of them were arrested, some of them were exiled. It's an interesting complication to thinking about loyal opposition, because even the loyal opposition in a place like Tunisia was repressed when it was, you know, convenient for the regime to do so. Yeah, so I think as a result, you end up seeing, I have one example on my mind where a former minister who ends up in exile because he was no longer useful to the regime, you know, cooperates with Islamists because there is this shared sense of wanting to get the regime back on track, and also that they've both been victimized by the same opponent.
I'm going to do a couple of questions that are about Egypt. So one is on the polarizing effects caused by, the question is about the polarizing effects caused by street battles and street violence between groups during the transition. I also researched this, I'm sorry, this is, we have a name on this. This is from Sarah Hynek. She also researches Egypt, and it seems in particular, street battles were significant in terms of polarizing the Brotherhood from their opposition. For example, while Morsi was in power, these groups were violent towards each other, which was particularly traumatizing and polarizing, it seems. Maybe I just wanted to put in a couple of things that I would add on these lines, because this was a question I had too, is the importance of the revolutionary, that transitional moment of the revolution, so like the Bouazizi's self-immolation up through January 11th, or the, you know, Ben Ali getting on the plane, there was that intense moment, and then the Egyptian one extending you know, several weeks longer in a different kind of a stage in Tahrir Square. But then these transition points of the kind of violence that's happening in both countries under the provisional government. I think there's two pieces there on this idea of street violence, or what kind, you know, direct kind of violence.
Yeah, I mean, that's super interesting. I'm gonna have to think a little bit more about this, but I think that might speak a little bit more to maybe mass polarization, right? Like watching members of different groups attacking each other, you know, the extent to which there's already a polarized feeling of affect or preference differentiation might make it more likely that, you know, people are going to blame the other group for this violence. In terms of the elite level, I mean, I think, you know, there's a couple of things going on. Morsi, in a lot of ways, acted very dictatorial during this period, and I think, you know, had there been less polarization at an elite level, there might have been more of an attempt by, you know, Brotherhood leadership to maybe rein some of that stuff in. I don't know. This is a little bit outside of what I look at, but you know, violence certainly does have the ability to polarize these groups even more.
I mean, I guess there's that piece there, because you could say you have all of this legacy of the experience under the oppressive government, and the levels of repression, the types of repression, differentiated, undifferentiated, et cetera, that sets up, primes that moment of the revolutionary moment, which is not it's a long moment, right? It's a period of weeks, a period of months, maybe it's a period of years. Then you have what happens during that period, and how that earlier time frame sets up certain dynamics here, but these things, it seems like, also have their own, can add into, I think this question is kind of getting to those, add in their own dynamics. You could think of, you know, the years of the Iranian Revolution and participating in collective mobilization, for instance, in any of these cases over time together, that you, I mean, we also have this solid, I mean, some of my images would be of that solidarity you see in Tahrir Square, or in some of the other, you know, like the February 20th marches in Morocco, which you've literally got everyone from the far right to the far left that are kind of together in a moment. And I guess maybe kind of having you push us, like, what's a kind of a hierarchy of importance here in terms of once you get into, I'm thinking like when Morsi's actually in power, they're actually in a parliamentary setting trying to come up with a new constitution. That to me is where you're pointing to more.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for that clarification. I think in both cases, and I've been spending more time thinking about this for my next project, but Walter Ambers has this great ethnography of the Egyptian Revolution where he talks about like how magical this moment is, right? The 18 days in Tahrir, the however many weeks of protest in Tunisia, it's magical, right? It's like the way people describe it is like a dream. it's overcoming, even though, of course, there were instances, there were fights between people, there were people sitting on different parts of the square. There's this feeling of we're all in this together, we're all working together, that gets reified as this like magical moment. And I am not necessarily talking about that. I'm interested in then how once kind of politics as usual reemerges, how what came before the revolution conditions what comes after. Because I think in both cases, there is this really, I mean, it's a beautiful way that people describe it. It's, you know, all of us Tunisians together from different backgrounds, different perspectives, different political agendas. We're all in the square together, but that falls apart pretty quickly. In the case of Egypt and in Tunisia, again, not trying to say that this is a perfect story, but the ability to kind of hold on to that cooperation, to keep coming back to the negotiating table, that was conditioned by what happened before December 2010.
This is sort of continuing along this line, another question. I have a question regarding the impact of oppression on opposition cooperation. Your argument that targeted repression in Egypt led to polarization within Egypt's opposition implies that the opposition was divided. However, in Egypt under Mubarak, there was significant cooperation between Islamists and leftists. How would you explain that?
Yeah, so I think probably this question is referring to like the Kifaya movement. The narrative about Kifaya is that it brought together so many different groups working together against essentially the inheritance of the presidency by Gamal Mubarak, Hosni Mubarak's son. I asked a number of people who had been present during those negotiations, during that movement, about what the actual relationship was between these groups. And even though there were some representatives from the Brotherhood there, a number of them were kind of, you know, no longer central parts of the Brotherhood. These were more like the Wasat level generation. And beyond that, there was never a conversation about the role of religion in politics, which, as I demonstrate in the book, it's super central to, you know, negotiating a new constitution, holding new elections. And it really was kind of a negative coalition in that it was focused on this one issue. And there was no way, the participants that I spoke to made it very clear that there was no way for them to actually talk about things that had substance, that had teeth, because there was such a high level of disagreement. So, you know, of course, this is not, no story is perfect in terms of there was no cooperation at all. But I think what I'm trying to do is problematize the level of cooperation that existed. I don't think it was as deep as we might have thought. And, you know, people reflecting on it now recognize that they didn't ever get to the core issues because there was such a level of disagreement about, you know, religion and politics in particular.
Great. So a question from Selena Ho. On the aspects, the gender dimensions of repression, often women and children of incarcerated men in Tunisia face stigma and isolation in their own communities, as well as harassment and abuse from the state. And she asked if there's a difference in that type of oppression.
Across Egypt and Tunisia?
This was about Tunisia. I mean, I think it seems like society-based, is there society-based repression in this sort of stigma and isolation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, maybe one way in which that's a really interesting part of it. When it's groups from multiple opposition types or individuals from multiple opposition groups who are feeling that, that's potentially a bridging experience. In a place like Egypt, where that was very much concentrated within one group, the Brotherhood, you know, that could further isolate families from other Egyptian families, both in the opposition and out.
I have a couple of questions that are asking you to think outside of your take two cases. One is from Hiba Malek. How would you identify the increasing polarization in Turkey and its impact on its democracy? Is it going down the path similar to Tunisia or Egypt? Do you feel comfortable making extensions in the region?
Not really, but I would recommend Avital Livni's new book. I think it just came out last week, about levels of trust in Turkey across different groups and how that, you know, makes democratic consolidation difficult. I would say, so she and I are actually writing book reviews together, which is why this is on my mind. my understanding of Turkish history, which is not great, admittedly, is that some of what I'm arguing in terms of, you know, groups feeling like they are being treated differently and potentially more poorly by the state, I think features in the AKP's rise. That there is very much this you know, aggressive secularization campaign that some people feel victimized by, and that, you know, creates a potential electorate of people who wanted there to be more you know, Islam and religion in public life and in politics. But I'm not comfortable going further than that.
Well, closer to home, this is a question from Vish Saktivel, who asks you to just, I mean, she's thinking of the timeliness of this and with respect to the Arab Spring, but also in terms of what's happening here in the United States. Do you see parallels, or can you discuss parallels, not only in our polarization and its implications for democracy, but also in the experiences of victimization and repression, especially for Black, persons of indigenous persons of color, how that is underlining identity formation and framing grievances in the United States? Yeah, I mean, just kind of thinking of the United States right now.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So when I've presented this to people who know way more about American politics than I do, they have said to me this feels like the story of kind of African American mobilization, that there is this, I mean, very clearly, very different treatment by the state in terms of repression that creates a certain kind of identity in a way that may polarize people around certain issues. And in some ways it can be helpful, right? It actually helps people get mobilized, vote, lobby for different causes. But it does potentially set up quite a high level of political polarization when white and Black citizens experience repression so differently in the United States. I would also say, I think, you know, this is a little bit beyond what I talk about in the book, but the way in which, you know, polarization right now in the United States seems to be couched in a lot of terms about like who is victimized by what policies. I think that is a dangerous but very effective way at mobilizing people, at you know, polarizing people in a way that can be effective for one or the other party. So I think there's a lot there. The two scholars that I'm thinking of, or the one scholar I'll mention is Keela Crabtree, who's looking at something very similar in her dissertation. She's a graduate student at the University of Michigan, but about, you know, the way in which violence is experienced very differently by different communities in the United States and what that means for their politics.
We have a little bit of time left. I'm going to offer you a question, but I think it's a nice way to segue into a final, just giving you some space at the end here to talk about what you're working on next. You've hinted at it a little bit, and some of the ways that you think this could be extended beyond your own study, kind of areas that can would be relevant in terms of following up. So I think the question I have here is, how much difference did it make? Like counterfactual is the fact that Rashid Ghannouchi, the major Islamist leader in Tunisian opposition, is exiled and has a certain experience in exile and develops a kind of, so I'm shifting away from any class of repressed and actors into this, you know, a great man or a single figure, their influence. Is the fact that Tunisia had Rashid Ghannouchi and Egypt didn't, is that the factor? That Morsi is not exiled in spending time in developing a modified, democratized sort of Islamist framework? Yeah. And so yeah, I'm softballing that to you to talk about.
Yeah. Well, before I answer seriously, I think one of the most interesting parts of Rashid Ghannouchi's exile is that he meets Al Stepan, who is no longer with us, but is a major political scientist. And so I kind of always joke that like maybe it was Al Stepan that Tunisia had. But in all seriousness, I think,
I guess where I'm pushing that is that there is a moment in these kind of 2012, 2013, great, where I think there's a degree of agency that this one person is acting within his movement in terms of saying, we're going to back off. We're not going to stand for elections at that level. We're going to hand it over to Nidat Tounes so I guess this is where I don't want to not everyone may not have understood where I was going with that question, but that's part of my context there.
Yeah, and I guess my perspective on that is that there are a couple of things. Of course, you know, Rashid Ghannouchi made some very important decisions, but so did a bunch of other politicians in Tunisia, right? Like people who were willing to step down from positions of power at the right time, accepting, you know, things that Rashid Ghannouchi said on face value. So I think in both cases, the way I would answer that is that both Mohamed Morsi and Rashid Ghannouchi are products of their environment, of their repressive environments. So yeah, I mean, what's interesting about I think Anafa has done a really good job of promoting kind of Rashid Ghannouchi, and he has done some amazing things. But there are a lot of other politicians that had to be involved in making those decisions, accepting those decisions, making sure that they were implemented. Yeah, I mean, a number of people that I spoke with, you know, we see a lot of the public kind of end results, but there were a number of negotiations that happened behind closed doors, people having conversations with each other and being honest with each other and taking other opinions seriously that led to some of those major decisions during this key moment where the wrong decision might have derailed the whole thing. I mean, it's certainly contingent on really important decisions made by, you know, central actors, but, you know, it's not just these individuals. I mean, my perspective is it's not just these individuals, it's kind of the entire group of people who have to buy into this moment.
Oh, can you tell us more about what you're working on now?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, you know, my book more or less stops in 2014, although I, you know, talk about the implications for the last couple of years. What I'm interested in looking at now is kind of the aftermath of what's happened in Egypt. So, you know, a defeated revolution. I don't like the term failed because it implies something on behalf, you know, of the people who risked a lot to undertake a revolution. But I'm interested in figuring out basically where did Egypt's activists go? A number of them have been arrested and disappeared, but a large number of them, potentially tens of thousands, have ended up in exile, whether that's formal or informal, meaning, you know, the government made it clear they should not come back versus an official travel ban. And so I'm, you know, similar to kind of reconceptualizing repression as this identity formation process. I'm interested in looking at exile as an identity formation process to try and figure out how does this dislocation from the homeland and, you know, the experience of being a migrant and, you know, the emotions, the very real emotions and the way in which the revolution kind of disrupted a lot of these activists' lives, how does that all translate into the way in which these activists are continuing to mobilize now or not? And I've started to present this. People have brought up some really interesting comparisons that I need to think more about. But you know, in the case of Iraq, you have an exiled opposition that's very influential for politics that happen down the road. And so, you know, thinking through again, what role might these exiles have if and when there's another chance at democratization in a place like Egypt or, you know, other defeated revolutions after the Arab Spring is kind of, you know, what I'm interested in looking at.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating. I think, you know, it's as a class of like a political phenomenon that you've got it from, I mean, many different periods, but I'm thinking even from the colonial exile that you have, name your case with from Ho Chi Minh to the much of the leadership of the FLN to
Right.
Mohammed V and from Morocco, and you know, there's that, and then this present day, obviously, this recurrent phenomena from Ayatollah Khomeini to, you know, Rashid Ghannouchi to, you know, this whole the people that you're studying here. So I think it's really going to be fascinating and exciting to see how you pull it together. We're going to wrap it up here. I am going to, one, thank you so much, Liz. It's, just want to remember, this might be backwards. Check it out, the book. Also, the artwork is really fascinating. You'll have to follow up with Liz. It's a beautiful, like really cool book cover there. So thank you so much for getting us started. I want to just remind everybody that this is all fall. We're going to be having these sessions. Next week, we have Zarina Grewal, who's going to be talking about her book, Islam is a Foreign Country, that she published a while ago, but talking about it after the Muslim ban. And she'll be with us next week. So it's same time, same place. You can look for the webinar information there through the link that Daniel sent out. And anyway, really appreciate you all being with us and to join us. And And also, I think all semester will be going, inshallah, let's get together in person soon. We hope for that very much. So take care. Bye, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan.